This is TWiT.
You want to talk about American rye whiskey?
Oh,
Yes.
Rye whiskey.
It is a category. American rye whiskey has specific guidelines around it. Its main thing is 51% rye. So this is a different kind of grain. It's been around a long time. It's not as popular as it used to be for a variety of reasons. Most American rye is going to also have corn and barley in it as well. Again, the barley provides some amylase, which decreases the methanol bounce. Corn is an inexpensive grain. Similar to American bourbon, it must be distilled no higher than 80% ABV and barreled at no more than 62.5%. So that part is similar. It needs to be aged in American oak. It's a minimum aging. If you age it for at least 2 years, you're allowed to call it straight rye whiskey as long as it has no blending in it. But it's not particularly popular. It's having a resurgence now. But the original rye whiskeys weren't from Kentucky. They were from the Northeast, New York, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the areas where they grow or used to grow a lot of rye. What took out rye whiskey for the most part was Prohibition. So during Prohibition, most distilleries in the Northeast closed down and rye consumption went down and a lot of farmers planted wheat. They switched to modern grains. So I remember it's the 20s, it's in the 30s that all of this goes down. And that's also when the engineering of grain started to change. And one of the things that we discovered as we explored our ability to modify crops and increase yields is that rye didn't increase in yield, but wheat and corn did. And so if you're a farmer, the opportunity to grow more per acre meant more money. And so rye became simply a less popular grain. It was also didn't make as nice, bread wheat makes nicer bread. That's why they call it bread wheat. It's got a higher gluten content. It's an effective product for that. So while the booze wasn't around for a few years, a lot of those things changed. And so coming out of Prohibition, you just don't have a lot of rye anymore. Now, again, that's specifically American rye. The few distilleries that sort of were still around at the end of Prohibition and being bought up by the Kentuckians who were doing very well. And so we'll talk about a couple of those brands. There are other kinds of rye whiskey. Specifically, most people think of rye whiskey as Canadian rye whiskey, which is essentially no standard at all. Back in the pre-Prohibition era, the Canadians grew rye extremely well, so a lot of their whiskeys had a lot of rye in them. But there was no standard to that, and there still isn't. So today you can buy something called Canadian rye whiskey. It's got no rye in it. Although at the same time, there are also Canadian rye whiskeys that are almost 100% rye. But again, no standard. A lot of existing well-known brands are now making a rye. Angel's Envy's got one. Dickel has one. Knob Creek makes a rye. Rittenhouse makes a rye. But if you talk about the original rye whiskeys, the pre-Prohibition rye whiskeys, almost all those brands are gone. One of the very few you can still find is Old Overholt, which was literally from the early 1800s in Pennsylvania. And they did not survive Prohibition. Their assets were sold off and bought by Jim Beam, which now produces that product in their style with a high rye amount. And that is not the whiskey I wanted to talk about. The specific whiskey I wanted to talk about was from Leopold Brothers. So Leopold Bros is a modern distillery. So these are two brothers. Todd studied brewing in the 90s. He wanted to be a brewmaster. He actually apprenticed in Europe, came back home. His brother, Scott, studied industrial engineering, manufacturing, and so forth. And they made beer for a while in Michigan and then got into distilling, found it way more fun. And in the early 2000s, they quit on brewing, built a facility in Colorado specifically to make whiskeys. And Scott was more of the historian too, and he found some of these old recipes from the 1800s for rye whiskeys, and they started experimenting with it. So they opened their facility in 2014, and they're pretty old school in some respects. So they still do floor malting. We talked about this in the Scottish series, talking about malting. So they malt their own barley, which takes about a week. While they're sticking to the old style, I've seen some videos of some of their facilities. They've got these ultra smooth concrete floors so they can do a little bit more mechanical handling of the malt. But they use European drying kilns. Like they're following a lot of standards. So they've got their own barley. But their big thing when making their rye is that they use a super old school rye called Abruzzi rye. So this is out of the Abruzzo region in Italy, which again been growing rye for centuries.
Ah,
And it's a very low starch rye, so
I
it
didn't
doesn't
know
make
that.
bread. And so they've managed to be a Abruzzo rye is pretty popular these days in a sort of eclectic areas, but because it's a low starch rye, it has very little gluten, so it's good for brewing, but not for much else. And its yield is low. So while it was popular pre-prohibition, again, you get back to farmers switched crops because it wasn't good for bread. They went to other things, and so it kind of died out. But you don't malt rye, you just grind it, and they do all of that. They have their own mashing techniques. They use fairly high temperature mashing, about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. They use cypress tank for fermentation, which is super old school. These are open top. They're actually encouraging lambic yeast as well. So while they use a blend of brewer's yeast, which you both reacted so positively to as yeast creams, you remember. Yeah, I think you remember. They're a normal fermentation with a yeast cream like that is pretty quick. Within 48 hours or so, your yeast is already dying off because it consumed all the sugar. But they actually hold it in the tank for another 48 hours to allow the slower yeast and the slower bacteria, the lactobacillus and so forth, to, quote, sour the mash. So those are actually bacteria that sustain themselves in the wood. And so while it's not as fast acting as these yeast creams, they do create their own flavor. There's a bunch of ways to approach sour that different distilleries approach, but this is super old school. Now, there's two different ryes that they make, neither of which I can find in Canada, which is very frustrating. And the one I'm going with first is their Maryland style rye, 100 proof, which is 50% ABV. If you can find it, apparently it's available in Total Wine for about $70 US. The mash bill on this is 65% rye, 15% corn, 20%.
Can I ask you a question about this? So, yeah. It seems to me that as craft distillery activity grows and grows and grows, it's a big thing. Mm-hmm. This is maybe the next extension because rye usually to me has much more of a kind of a bite to it than bourbon, which is very smooth.
Yeah, well, normally when we make bourbon, we use rye as the flavor grain, the middle grain.
Yeah,
and it has that spiciness to it.
But it's sharp. It's sharp like a Scotch can be sharp, right?
Yes.
The flavor from bourbon comes from the wood. Is that the same
but the sweetness comes from the corn? Like bourbon actually has a strong sweet flavor, especially when you get weeded bourbons. Think Blanton's or Mark.
I wonder if
very little
rye
bite.
Doesn't. I'm sorry.
No.
I wonder if it doesn't appeal to a growing base of kind of whiskey enthusiasts, who want the more complex. Maybe.
Well, and I would argue, especially when you talk about like Dickel making rye on the side, that they are taking
Dickel making rye on the side is a beautiful episode.
Because they normally make bourbon, right? So they are starting to make a rye that they are trying to appeal to a different audience. This is a very different product because of the Abruzzi rye. It's not as spicy. It's more floral.
Okay.
So it has a different character to it.
Floral, like a gin is floral, or
not botanical, but more complex flavor notes. Like that's what it's known for. It just doesn't go high yield, so it makes it expensive. I mean, it's a $70 bottle.
I don't think I've ever run into anything like this. I think that's the issue.
That's the appeal to me, and it was my friend Eric that put me onto this, and I started reading, and I'm like, like now I got to go find one of these.
Right.
But I haven't been able to find one. There's another version they make that I'm trying to hunt down because they bought a 3-chamber still. This is super old school. Like, a normal column still, which is what they're making their Maryland style with, is a continuous operation where you're preparing your wort on one side, and you're able to continuously feed it in the still, so you crank a lot of yield out. A 3-chamber still is a very primitive version of a column still, where rather than having lots of thin plates, it has 3 large plates, and it's not efficient. Its production rate is really low. Like ever since the 1800s, when we got the coffee still running, like there was no reason to run a still like this anymore, except that it has really interesting flavor characteristics. And so what they call the 3 chambers rye, which is much more expensive, it's like a $250 bottle of whiskey. They're using this old-fashioned still and with a thumper, which is a great term.
Yep.
You got this, it's quite a large, bulky columnar still with 3 distinct layers into it. And so as it's heated, the vapors come up and then they land in the second chamber where they cool a bit. And then they get hotter again and they'll go up to the next chamber. So it's kind of a slow process. It's maybe 10% or even 5% of the production rate of a regular still. And it needs routine cleaning because you're putting the mash in, the wort in. And then the thumper actually comes off the lie arm. And they call it a thumper because, stills don't run continuously, really. They sort of build up heat, and then a certain amount of the distillate comes down the lie arm. And when it lands in this pot still, it thumps. It makes a sort of a bang, which is why it gets called a thumper. But it's a second stage or a separate stage of pot distillation that then rises up and goes through the condenser. It's just like these guys have really hybridized a modern operation with some really old school technique. Like, I really want to sit down with both of these bottles and drink them side by side.
And I would like to watch you do it, because then I could have some too.
Well, I mean, I've been thinking about talking about rye for a while, just because it has its own character. There's no two ways about it. And it does seem to be making a resurgence, although most of the time it's bourbon makers who are like, oh, you want a rye? Well, here's a rye. We just tinkered with the mash, right? But these guys are approaching rye like it's 1820. Like it's way back. It's pre-coffee still. It's pre any of this.
I think that speaks to this whole movement of craft distillery in a way, right? I mean, I know it's not the same as a mom and pop store, but I mean, going back to this is a great way to differentiate. Yeah,
and just to make it's like, hey, you really like whiskey? Why don't you try it? Like, I think about Glenlivet's Nadura and Shackleton as sort of these throwback whiskeys to get back, get rid of the processes that they worked about in the 1970s when whiskey wasn't popular. It's like, make sure it doesn't get cloudy and make sure it, works well with ice and these things. It's like, oh no, I like whiskey for whiskey, so let's go drink more whiskey that's more whiskey.
Right.
And these folks seem to have fallen into this in Colorado of all places. So I'm delighted. And it's like, I don't get many missions these days for whiskey. I generally know what I'm drinking. I'm excited. You saw me find that Perth 23 and how delighted I was with that.
Yeah.
But this is something I hadn't had a chance to explore. It's old school rye, and I want some.
I think this is I think rye, a lot of people are afraid of rye. They're just a little too harsh. And
and I suspect this isn't, because they switched up the grain.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my story this week. Now eventually I'll find one and you'll see me drink it.
But here in the States, we can find it readily, which is interesting.
It looks like it's around. So I would certainly recommend the Maryland, just because that's an old school approach to a rye whiskey.
You are going to Seattle soon.
The 3 chambers sounds more appealing to me. It sounds a little bit like for less of a hardcore.
Just price.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a $300 bottle.
It's like whiskey for adults.
So when they say 3 chambers, they mean 3 Franklins.
300. Yeah, no. Well, it's 3 chambers because it uses that different still, and it's expensive.
Yeah.
But what I like about this is it's not like Yamazaki 12, where it won a bunch of awards and suddenly went from $40 to $400.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a whiskey.
It's actually expensive
difficult
to
make. And so they charge.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I guess I'm off to Bevmo, and you guys are off to bed. It's time to say good night.